This is lesson 11, and there's a lot of information in this lesson, but it's not too difficult at this point because you should have all the basics down. You start out with the declension of the irregular word duo, duai, duo. It's kind of like a 2-1-2 adjective. It's always going to follow the pattern of masculine, feminine, and neuter. And the feminine form, you can see, is pretty regular. But it can only be declined in the plural. That's unusual, but it makes sense because it's the word for the number 2, the cardinal number 2. And then it is irregular and it must be memorized. That's all there is to it. You can't get around this one. It's sort of like a 2-1-2 adjective, but it obviously breaks down a lot. Take a look at the forms, practice these. Duo, duorum, that's normal genitive plural ending. Duobus, you have not seen that kind of ending yet, although you'll see it in this lesson for the third declension. Duos, that's a regular ending, and then it goes back to duobus. And that follows the same pattern that you've seen all along in the plural, where the dative plural and the ablative plural have the same kind of endings. Then duai, duarum, that's normal, pretty normal for the first declension. It's got the A as the pattern. Duobus, duas, and duobus. Again, this ending is pretty normal. And although you haven't seen the bus ending yet, you will see it in this lesson in the third declension. So it's irregular and pretty strange. Duo, duorum, duobus, duo. In the neuter, the nominative and accusative are always the same. If you haven't noticed this pattern yet, the nominative singular and the nominative plural is exactly the same every single time in the neuter. The nominative and accusative, whether it's singular or plural, in this case, of course, it's plural, the nominative and accusative are always exactly the same. Duorum is the same as duorum. You've seen this pattern before where the masculine and neuter are the same. Duobus is the same, duo, and then duobus. So it's just a matter of practicing this one. It's not the most common word, it's not the most important word, but it is something that needs to be memorized, something that I can put on tests, and you will encounter it in this textbook. Similarly, the word for thousand, mila. This word literally translates as 1,000 or 1,000, either 1,000 or 1,000. This does not get declined at all. Whether you have 1,000 girls in the plural, there's the nominative plural feminine for girl, or whether you have 1,000 boys, you do not need to make this adjective agree in case, number, and gender with any of the nouns you are dealing with. It does not get declined. It does not have a nominative. It does not have an accusative. It does not have any case ending. It's always just mila. You will see, however, as I write up here, that the Romans did use another word, essentially, it looks very much the same, milia, to mean thousands. It's a strange distinction between 1,000 and milia, thousands. And this word, you will see in a later lesson, they did decline. But for now, don't worry about that. You only need to know the word mila as a word for 1,000 or 1,000, and mila never declines. I'll go over this again in a later lesson so you understand the difference between mila and milia. But it's a minor little point. Sorry, only one L. This point is the big point in the lesson, the regular third declension noun. So far you've been working primarily just with the first and second declension. We have not touched upon the third declension in any way, although I've told you from the beginning that there's a first, a second, a third, a fourth, and a fifth declension. As of today, you'll be responsible for the first, the second, and the third. There is a regular third declension, and there are I stem third declensions. So 2 major subcategories of third declension. As you'll see, however, there are even subcategories of the subcategories, and as you learn more in the coming lessons, you'll see that there is a lot of variety in the third declension. It's really the hardest declension to learn, so learn this right the first time. Fourth and fifth declension are pretty easy, and they don't even show up as much in the general vocabulary. Third declension shows up all the time, and it's the most complicated. But don't be worried about that. If you learn it right the first time, all the rest of the irregular forms will come easily to you. The lexical entry, that is to say, the way it looks in the dictionary, is going to have the same pattern as nouns of the first and second declension. That is to say, you're going to find the nominative singular and the genitive singular, usually in some kind of abbreviated form, but I like to write them out in full, especially in the third declension, because it is very difficult to predict the principal parts of these nouns. As you can already see from the nominative and the genitive, you lose the E, for example, in pater, patris. There's no way you could have predicted that without being a native speaker of Latin. Arbor, arboris. You may start to think that, okay, the nominative ends with an R because the first 2 examples do, but that is not true. The first entry in the dictionary is highly irregular, and here's the proof of that. Rex turns into regis. So you've seen that you can lose an E from the nominative to the genitive. You've seen that it can end in an R in 2 examples, but rex obviously doesn't end with an R, and there's nothing you can do to really make learning the nominative singular any easier. That has to be memorized or looked up in the dictionary. The important part, though, just as it was for the first and second declension, is the genitive. The genitive singular is where you get your stem for all of the other case endings. The nominative is highly irregular, but the genitive, dative, accusative, ablative, and all the plurals are based on the genitive form, the second thing in the dictionary. It's a very important point about the third declension. With the third declension, the nominative you can't predict, but the genitive will be the basis for all of the other forms. So to find the stem and decline this in all the different case endings, you follow the same process as you did with the first and second declension nouns. You take the second thing in the dictionary, which is the genitive singular. After you take the second thing in the dictionary, you drop the ending, which is always going to be is. You can see that all 3 of these examples end in is in the genitive singular. And when you drop the is, now you have the stem for all of the forms except for the nominative singular. The nominative singular you have to memorize or look up in the dictionary. You cannot predict the nominative singular. All you can do is take the second thing in the dictionary and find the stem by dropping the is. This stem is used for all the forms except for the nominative singular. All the other forms, the genitive singular, dative singular, accusative singular, ablative singular, and all the plurals, the nominative plural, genitive plural, dative, accusative, and ablative. And of course the vocative, which I don't emphasize in the class because it is very rare and not a priority, will also be formed from this same ending based on the genitive. Nominative singular, remember, you cannot predict that. You have to look it up or memorize it. But all the other forms, starting with the genitive singular, are based on the second thing that you find in the dictionary. After you've dropped the is, for example, regis would become reg, then you add the third declension masculine and feminine endings. We are not going over the neuter in this lesson. The neuter will be taught in the next lesson. It has slightly different endings than the masculine and feminine. So after you've found the stem, like arborous would become arbor, then you add the third declension masculine and feminine endings, which are found on the next slide. So let's take the example of rex. In the dictionary, you look up the word rex regis. You take the second thing in the dictionary, regis, you drop the is, and now you have the stem. Now I'm going to show you the endings that you add to decline it. So you start out with reg, and to the nominative, you can't really do it based on that stem. So for the nominative, you have to just look it up in the dictionary or have it memorized. The nominative singular is rex. I can't teach you how to decline that. You have to be a native speaker or you have to memorize it. And then we go down to the genitive singular. You take the second thing in the dictionary, drop the is, and then for the genitive singular, you add the is. For the dative singular, you add the I. The accusative singular, you add em. And for the ablative singular, you add just an e. Same thing down here. Add es, add add ibis. This is what I reminded you of earlier. It's kind of like duibus, that dative ending or ablative ending. Then you add es, and then you add ibis again. The pattern is very much the same. The dative and ablatives are the same. In this declension, the third declension, the nominative and accusative have the same endings. The genitive plural is similar to the first and second declension. Instead of O-R-U-M or A-R-U-M, it's just U-M. So it's somewhat similar, if that helps you at all. And then in the singular, the nominative, of course, is very strange. You have to look that one up. This is not very predictable based on what you've learned before, nor is this. The EM is similar to the first and second declension, which is AM or UM. At least it has that same M in the accusative. And then rega is not very predictable. In the first declension, it ends with an A. In the second declension, it ends with an O. So not much I can help you with as far as patterns from the past. It's just a new pattern that you have to memorize. It's one that you'll use every single time you read. So the third declension is very common, very regular, and not really easily predictable based on what you've learned before. Let me give you one more example. If you have arbor, arborous, you'd have to look up the nominative in the dictionary. It's arbor. Then you would take arborous, which is the second thing you find in the dictionary, drop the is, and then use that stem to decline all the rest of the forms. Adding the endings, the same endings throughout. And this process or these endings are the same regardless of whether this word happens to be masculine or feminine. These are the endings for all the masculines and all the feminines. Arborous, as far as we know, could be masculine or feminine. It doesn't really matter because the endings turn out to be the same. The gender will matter when you work with adjectives. For example, rex is masculine. You have to know that in order to match it up with the right adjective. But as far as adding the endings, they're the same whether it's masculine or feminine. This is one of your biggest priorities, memorizing these endings and practicing this declension. If there are other things that you are not doing all your work with, if you haven't memorized the vocabulary very well, if you're not memorizing the verb principal parts, that is not as important as mastering the third declension. Make that your priority for the rest of the semester. In the same lesson, I'm going to show you the third declension I stems. They have an I in them. That's why they're called I stems. It's a very clear description. Third declension I stems are not the regular third declensions which you just saw. They have a very slight difference, and they're the first variety or subcategory of the third declension that you'll learn. So there's the regular third declensions that you've just seen, and now you're learning I stems. There are, in addition, other categories of third declension that you will learn. And remember, so far, you are only learning the masculine and feminine endings. You have not seen any neuter endings, either in the regular variety of third declension or the I stem variety of third declension. So 2 subcategories of the third declension you know so far. There's nothing different in this process. As usual, what you do is you follow the same process. You take the second thing in the dictionary. It's the same whether it's the first, second, or regular third declension noun. You take the second thing in the dictionary, which is the genitive singular. You drop the ending, which is going to be is for a third declension, I stem or regular. And then you add the third declension I stem endings. In this case, we're only learning the masculine and feminine, not the neuter yet. On the next slide, you can see the third declension I stem endings. It's a very small difference from the regular endings. The difference is very minor. The only variety is that in the genitive plural, you add an I. That's why it's called the I stem. In the plural and singular neuter, there are more differences. But so far, we're only doing the masculine and feminine varieties. So here's an example of a word. It means limit. Finis. Finis is how it appears in the dictionary. So the nominative singular is exactly the same as the genitive singular. Here's another example. Pars, partus. In this case, the nominative singular is not the same as the genitive singular. That's why the nominative always has to be memorized or looked up. To do the declension, you follow the same process as you would for the regular third declension. You take the second thing in the dictionary, you drop the is. So for example, you would have fin, finis. The nominative, of course, is irregular. It's finis. And then for the genitive, you take the finis, drop the is, then add back the is, then add an I, then add an em, add the e, es, ium. Here's your only difference. Finibus, fines, and finibus. There is one tiny little difference there. The only problem with these is identifying them in the dictionary. When you first see them and find them in the dictionary, you are not going to be able to tell whether they're regular third declension or third I stem. So here's the trick of how to tell them apart. Rex regis is a regular third declension, not an I stem. Whereas finis is a third I stem. Third I stems, one of the ways you can tell them apart is that they have the same amount of syllables in the nominative singular and the genitive singular. Finis, 2 syllables, finis, 2 syllables. Therefore, you know that it's a third I stem. Rex has 1 syllable, followed by regis, which is 2 syllables. It is not a third I stem. That's one way to tell them from each other. The other way to tell them from each other is the model of pars partus. You'll note that this only has 1 syllable, followed by 2 syllables. So how is it distinguished from pars partus? From rex regis. It's distinguished from rex regis because it has 2 consonants before the is. Rex regis does not have 2 consonants before the is. It has a vowel and a consonant. Pars partus has 2 consonants. So the way to tell the third I stems from the regular third conjugation declensions is that they either have the same amount of syllables in the nominative singular and genitive singular, or they have 2 consonants before the is. Fairly simple. Not really important because you won't be composing too many Latin sentences in your entire life, even in this class, but necessary for you to recognize at this point so you can keep these 2 forms separate. One last very simple point. Adjectives still have to agree in case, number, and gender with the nouns they modify. They do not have to be spelled the same. We've gone over this point before, and you've seen examples, but here is where it really starts to come into play. Rex is a third declension, and it is nominative, singular, and masculine. The adjective bonus is a second declension, and it is also nominative, singular, masculine. This adjective and this noun agree in case, number, and gender. They don't have to agree in which declension they're in. You can be a good king even if the third declension and the second declension are put together. Adjectives only have to agree in case, number, and gender. They do not have to be spelled the same. They often will be spelled the same. For example, if you have the good friend, nominative singular masculine matches up with nominative singular masculine, and they are spelled the same, but obviously a second declension adjective can be mixed with the first declension noun, and so forth and so on, so that they might not always be spelled the same. Third declension is the one that really makes this obvious. Regis boni, they're both in the genitive. Regum bonum, they're both in the accusative. They're both in the same case, accusative, singular, and masculine. So the rule about adjectives agreeing in case, number, and gender has not stopped, obviously, just because you've learned a new declension. That's the end of the lesson. You learned duo, duai, duo, and mila, which is undeclinable, 2 indeclinable, 2 numbers. A little bit of irregularity for duo, duai, duo, but it kind of helps you predict and understand the regular third declension and then the slightly different third I stem declension. And then at the end, it's just a small reminder that nouns and adjectives always agree in case, number, and gender.